The Cleveland Browns draft just happened, and I want to cut through the headline reactions and the mock draft scorecards and talk about what these picks actually mean in the specific context this organization is operating in. Because when you evaluate these selections against what we've been tracking for months, the quarterback situation, the infrastructure problems, the developmental environment Shedeur Sanders genuinely needs to become what his talent suggests he can be, the picture that emerges is more coherent and more purposeful than the initial coverage has given it credit for being. Start with Pick 6, Spencer Fono, left tackle. And I want to be direct about this. It was the right call. It was always going to be the right call. And the reasoning behind it is the same reasoning we've been walking through since the offseason began. We talked at length about the steep quality drop-off in this tackle class after the top tier. We talked about why gambling on that position resolving itself later in the draft was a risk Cleveland had the assets to avoid entirely. Fono is the kind of physically imposing presence whose profile doesn't just add depth, it changes what a quarterback can actually do from a protection standpoint. 6'6", over 310 pounds, mobile enough to handle speed rushers on the edge while possessing the hand strength to neutralize power inside. The evaluation from people who studied his tape carefully describes exactly the kind of anchor presence that transforms an offensive line from a structural liability into a functional foundation. And when you're building a developmental environment around a quarterback who faced pressure on 39% of his dropbacks last season, the worst rate in the entire NFL, addressing that at the most important position on the offensive line isn't a preference. It's a structural necessity. Cleveland had the pick to do it. They did it. That decision will matter in October in ways that are visible and specific. Now I want to spend real time on KC Conception, because this is the pick in this draft class that I think is being most significantly undervalued in the initial reaction coverage. And the numbers he produced in college tell a story that the relative lack of pre-draft buzz around him simply doesn't reflect honestly. More touchdowns than Jordan Tyson. More touchdowns than Carnell Tate. More touchdowns than My Lemon. He left school with 28 touchdowns scored, with 1,000 yards from scrimmage and 10 touchdowns in 2 of his 3 college seasons. That consistent, sustained production across multiple seasons and different competitive contexts is exactly the kind of signal that translates most reliably to the professional level. Not one breakout year in a favorable scheme. Not a single dominant performance that generated highlight tape. Repeated production, over time, against varied competition. That's the evidence that actually means something when you're projecting a player forward. What excites me most about Conception specifically is the dimension of his game that makes him immediately useful rather than a developmental project you're waiting on. He can operate fluidly in the quick game, screens, slants, quick outs, which fits Shedeur's natural processing rhythm in a way that is specific and functional rather than theoretical. He can threaten vertically in one-on-one situations, which forces the pre-snap coverage distribution decisions that open everything else underneath. And he adds genuine special teams value as a punt returner, which means his contribution to the roster is immediate and multidimensional rather than contingent on developing into a featured starter role. At 6 feet and 200 pounds, he has the size to operate outside while possessing the quickness to create separation in intermediate areas. The fact that the same player can function as an outside receiver, a quick game safety valve, and a return specialist is exactly the kind of layered value that smart front offices find in the middle rounds of a draft. Cleveland found it here. Denzel Boston is the complementary receiver addition that gives Cleveland 2 pass catchers with meaningfully different profiles operating simultaneously. And that differentiation matters in ways that go beyond simply adding numbers to the receiving core. Where Conception brings quickness, route running refinement, and the ability to create in traffic, Boston brings the size and contested catchability that forces entirely different coverage decisions. A 6'4" receiver who wins jump ball situations on the outside changes the throwing geometry for a quarterback in ways that statistics don't fully capture. It opens angles and windows that don't exist when every target on the outside is similarly sized and similarly accountable. The combination of Boston creating on the perimeter and Conception operating in the quick game gives Shedeur distribution options that his receiving group last season genuinely and consequentially did not provide. The second offensive line selection, Austin Barber in the 3rd round, reinforces what I think is the clearest single organizational statement embedded in this entire draft class. Cleveland identified offensive line as the foundational infrastructure problem, addressed it with premium capital at pick 6, and then came back and addressed it again with mid-round capital in round 3. 2 picks, both on the offensive line, both aimed at the same underlying failure. Shedeur Sanders facing pressure on 39% of his dropbacks last season. That number is not a quarterback evaluation. That number is a structural failure of the environment around the quarterback. And the organization's decision to commit 2 draft selections, one early, one mid-round, to correcting it is the clearest possible signal that they understand the distinction between those 2 things and are acting on it with genuine, resource-backed conviction, rather than the language of conviction without the actions to match. The McNeil-Warren selection at safety addresses the defensive side of the construction, and the profile is compelling for reasons that connect directly to the complete organizational picture we've been building. 4 forced fumbles and 2 interceptions in his final college season describes a player with genuine playmaking instincts. Someone who doesn't just play sound defense, but creates opportunities that change field position and game flow. And that contribution matters specifically in the context of a young quarterback's development in ways that are real and underappreciated. A defense that generates turnovers and forces short fields takes pressure off the offense possession by possession in ways that box scores don't fully represent. Every drive that starts at midfield rather than your own 25-yard line is a drive where the offense doesn't need a perfectly executed full-field sequence to produce points. A ball-hawking safety who creates those opportunities at a consistent rate is not just a defensive asset in isolation. He's a developmental asset for the quarterback on the other side of the ball. Cleveland drafted that player. Todd Monken's press conference comments about the 4-quarterback room have been generating concern in certain corners of the coverage, and I want to address that directly because I think it's being badly misread. His framing was precise and consistent with everything he's communicated throughout the offseason. Competition is real. Depth charts are real. Rep distribution reflects the depth chart rather than treating everyone as equally positioned. Taylor Green is a developmental addition whose athletic traits lend themselves to specific package situations, designed runs, wildcat elements, moments where his athleticism creates problems a pure pocket passer doesn't generate. That kind of specialized addition doesn't introduce organizational ambiguity about the starting quarterback any more than a backup running back threatens the starter's job. It's roster construction and offensive flexibility. Reading it as uncertainty about Shedeur is importing a narrative that the operational evidence doesn't support. Monken's building has been consistent about its direction for months. One press conference about roster depth doesn't change what the rep distribution and the practice structure and the locker room have already communicated. When you step back and look at this draft in its totality, as a collection of decisions that collectively express organizational philosophy and priority, the picture is coherent in a way that deserves more credit than the initial reaction has given it. 2 offensive linemen addressing the protection environment around the franchise quarterback. 2 receivers addressing the vertical threat and quick game dimensions of a receiving core that wasn't forcing defensive coordinators to make difficult decisions before the snap. A defensive playmaker whose specific contribution mode, turnovers, forced fumbles, ball-hawking instincts creates the favorable conditions that support offensive development in a way that accumulates across a full season. Every single selection in this class traces back to a specific, identified deficiency in the environment around Shedeur Sanders. And every selection represents a concrete, resource-backed step toward correcting it. The external consensus around this draft being a quality outcome for Cleveland is broader than usual, and I think that breadth is meaningful in a specific way. When analysts operating with different frameworks and different tendencies and different prior dispositions toward this franchise independently arrive at the same positive assessment, it usually reflects genuine quality in the decision-making rather than a single perspective being validated by its own assumptions. The consensus here is genuinely wide. Here is where I actually land on what this draft means for the complete picture of what Cleveland is building. The organizational commitment to Shedeur Sanders, visible for months in the practice structure, the rep distribution, the captain designation before the competition was formally resolved, the locker room testimony from Garrett and Ward speaking with their names fully attached, the coaching staff's documented developmental investment. That commitment just got backed by the most concrete form of organizational expression available. Premium draft capital deployed at the positions that most directly determine whether a young quarterback develops in a functional environment or a broken one. They addressed left tackle. They addressed the receiver core. They came back and added offensive line depth in round 3. They selected a defensive playmaker who creates turnovers and field position. The connection between the decisions and the needs they address is specific and coherent, and that specificity is itself a form of organizational communication. The work isn't complete. The Joey Bosa conversation, if it develops into something formal, would add the defensive identity dimension that makes the complete construction genuinely formidable. The Watson situation still requires formal resolution before the starting job is officially what the operational signals have been suggesting for months. Training camp will bring its own evaluations and its own adjustments and its own complications, as training camp always does. Nothing in professional football is real until the evidence of execution starts accumulating in games that count. But what just happened in Cleveland over the course of this draft is the clearest possible organizational statement about what this franchise is trying to become and who they've decided to become it around. The capital was real. The needs were specific and documented. The connection between the selections and those needs was coherent, deliberate, and traceable through every pick. And the young quarterback at the center of all of it, the one who was in the coach's office all winter when showing up was optional, who posted 80% completion in 11-on-11 reps on day 1 of minicamp, who earned a captain designation before the competition was formally closed, who stood in front of the media and challenged the outside world to look honestly at the evidence rather than through the filter of draft position. That quarterback just watched his organization prove with its most valuable assets that the belief in him is not a talking point. It is not a narrative constructed for media consumption. It is operational. It is backed by picks and resources and deliberate construction. And in professional football, that distinction between belief as language and belief as action is quite literally everything.